Coalition for Democracy, along with my wonderful co-chair, Regina Bringhoff, who's around someplace. Regina. And I think you know, just a brief background on the Coalition for Open Democracy, which I think most of you know because you're here. It was, one of our founding members was Granny D. Haddock. And we, like Granny, are dedicated to stopping money politics in any way we can and building the powerful movement that we need, the movement of the people that will take our democracy back. We've got to do this. And we're the folks on the ground in New Hampshire for doing this. And like Granny D, we've had a few obstacles in trying to pass our bills, but we have zero quit. We will not quit until it's done. And believe it or not, whoops, believe it or not, that works. We have some good news today. This morning, by a vote of 13-5, we finally got through the Election Law Committee our SB 120 disclosure bill that we've been working on for a mere 4 years. And, we aren't counting any chickens left. This has been a huge roller coaster ride for the last 4 years. But it has passed the Senate. This was a bipartisan vote, which is very significant. And we passed the Senate with a 19-4 vote back in January. So we think we have the governor on board, and if we can somehow make it through the House and a little work on the an amendment the House did, I think we might have it. And this, for the first time, we will be able, the citizens of New Hampshire will know to the penny what the big independent groups like the Americans for Prosperity are spending to buy our elections. So this is information that I think we're going to be shocked, because it's as you probably have read, Americans for Prosperity, for example, has already spent more in 2014 than we spent in 2012. So people don't think it's here, but it is.
Local sheriffs. No.
Anyway, without further, there's some people we really need to thank. First and foremost is Rob Werner. Rob, if you could stand up. Rob did everything here. I mean, from soup to nuts, from getting Trevor to come and ordering the food, greeting people at the door. So we really appreciate all you've done, Rob. And our wonderful sponsors, Laura Magsis, Ling Chong, Lou Feldstein, Leslie Brothers, Senator Martha Fuller Clark over there, and Alex Ray, who is provide the food here at like tremendous discount for us. So please give these people. Now, my colleagues on the Coalition for Open Democracy Board gave me a challenge, and they said, we don't want the normal, boring introduction of an eminent person like Trevor Potter, and you know, where everyone kind of, I go through all the credentials. So I figured, I said, you know, Trevor Potter has been on the with Stephen Colbert on the Colbert Report many times, and as we all know, Steve Colbert is taking over The Late Show from David Letterman fairly shortly, and I heard through secret sources that they will be continuing the famous David Letterman top 10 list. So what I figured in honoring you is that this may bomb. And my wife has already left the room. She's used to this stuff. But these are the top 10 reasons why we are so honored and privileged to have Trevor Potter here tonight. Number 10, he is dashing and debonair and a connoisseur of sushi. And looks fabulous on TV. Number 9, He has by far the best picture of any person who you've ever put on a cod brochure. And he has beat Larry Lessig by a fuller hair. Number 8, he can share the inside scoop with us as a past commissioner and chair of the Federal Election Commission and counsel to several presidential campaigns. Number 7, he is a Granny D hero. He has defended the McCain-Feingold law that our own Granny D walked across the country to help enact. Number 6, he's a world traveler who amazingly did not get jet lag on the long flight here from Washington, D.C. And according to the flight attendants I talked to after the trip, he took only his fair share of peanuts on this luxury U.S. Air flight. Number 5, he is probably the premier expert in the country on the corrupting influence of big money politics on our elections and democracy, and is incredibly effective in avoiding lawyer speak and communicating that to us all. Number 4, better yet, he is also probably the premier expert on solving the problem of money politics, very key, and is the lead author of the very comprehensive American Anti-Corruption Act, that when we the people pass this thing, will restore people politics and make Granny D very proud. Number 3, he has somehow been able to bring constructive humor to this kind of humorless and difficult critical issue of campaign finance reform. It was behind Steve Colbert's Super PAC, Americans for a Better Tomorrow, that explained the flim-flam scheme that in Super PACs so well. It not only won a Peabody Award for this, which is for clarity in these public issues, but my cat got it watching it. Number 2, he walks the walk as well as talking the talk as founder and head of the Campaign Legal Center in Washington, D.C. that provides incredible advice to the movement that is to stop money politics. And of course, all you're waiting for, and I wish I had the sound effect, that David Letterman has. The number 1 reason why it is a privilege and honor to have Trevor Potter here tonight is that he can address the rumors swirling around New Hampshire that when Steve Colbert takes over the Late Show from David Letterman, he will be Steve's sidekick. And he will be the one writing all the new top 10 lists. So that's really great.
I did not know that I was going to get a top 10 introduction list. I love it. Thank you. That is among the best I have ever had. Can I get a coffee afterwards? And then, when I need to have my ego inflated, I can just take a look at it. That would be much appreciated. It's a great pleasure to be with you all and to be, in my case, back in New Hampshire. I did spend a certain amount of time up here with Senator McCain when he was on the campaign trail. I must say it was one of those states that I've always had a happier feeling about. Say, unlike South Carolina, which always makes me kind of nervous. But I thank the Coalition for Open Democracy for the invitation to come up and be with you all tonight. I'm told that you actually paid good money to hear me speak. So I told Gordon that I had prepared about a 2-hour talk, so you get your money's worth. He suggested I trim it just a little bit so that there would be some time for questions at the end, which I promise I will do. And anytime you want to give me the hook, just let me know. I can't promise that I'll keep my end of the bargain and avoid lawyerese, but I will do my best. I am always nervous when I get what I call a Colbert introduction, because I then have to remind people of what I was told the first time I appeared on the show. I was standing behind the black curtain. They were about to push me out. He was just finishing his introduction, and now my personal lawyer, and so forth. And the woman who had walked me through this whole process and gotten me to this point leaned over and said, whispering in my ear, "Just remember, he's
the funny one.
So for those of you who were expecting an evening of Colbert humor, I am sorry, I have bad news for you. But I did want to talk, first of all, congratulations on the success that it sounds as if you're having on the disclosure bill. That's huge. New Hampshire is a place where people care about these issues, and my experience here has been that you all can make a difference. So it's exciting to be here in the middle of that process. I thought it'd be helpful to just look at where we are nationally and sort of how we got here, and then we can talk about what I hope are some solutions. But if we look at 2012, it's the first presidential election since corporations became people in Citizens United, and since Super PACs were created as a result of another court decision and allowed to raise and spend unlimited amounts of money in federal elections. It's also a presidential election in which hundreds of millions of dollars of secret money was spent by 501c4s, C6s, and these other groups that run campaign ads without becoming political committees and disclosing their donors. It's the first presidential election in more than 30 years in which neither candidate participated in the post-Watergate public funding presidential system, instead raising and spending hundreds of millions of dollars themselves. As 2012 demonstrated, the level of money spent in our federal elections continues to grow, climbing by large sums each year. 2012, there was about $7 billion spent in federal elections. If you compare that to the 2000 election, so a decade before, that was $3 billion, so more than 100% increase in that decade. House and Senate candidates, the costs keep going up. The average price for a Senate race is now $20 million, double what it was in 2002. 2012 saw a $29 million House race and an $85 million Senate race, actually two of those, Ohio and Virginia. Some of this spending is accounted for by the huge growth in what is called outside spending since Citizens United, meaning not candidate committees and not party committees. That number grew from about $300 million in 2008 and 2010 to over $1 billion in 2012. Worse, the amount of this $1 billion that was from secret sources, the so-called dark money, grew to about 40% of that total outside spending, $400 million nationwide in 2012. Now, there are a couple of problems with all of this money. The first is where it comes from, which is from a tiny, tiny minority of the American people. As you probably know, the FEC has a public disclosure system, runs a public disclosure system, and if anyone in this room gives to a federal candidate or a federal committee of any kind a contribution, and that totals in aggregate over $200 in the 2-year cycle, then that is publicly reported on the database. So if I give $50 to a candidate and then I feel moved to give another 100 and then another 50, I hit my 200 threshold and my name goes in the database as a candidate. So it is possible to look at that database and know the number of Americans, the percentage of Americans who are at that very, very low threshold level, $200 to any candidate or committee in 2 years, participating in our political system by financing elections. Any idea what percentage of Americans meet that minimum $200 threshold? Any ideas?
20%?
I heard 1%, I heard 20%. Those seem to be the angles of it.
0.3%.
He's close. The answer is you've got 1/3 of 1% of Americans actually participate at that very minimal level. So you have 99 2/3% of Americans who do not have speech. If speech is money, you have 99 2/3% of Americans who are not speaking in those elections. The new Super PACs, on the other hand, have lots of speech. Hundreds of millions of dollars in 2012. So here are a couple numbers about those PACs. Just over 600 people gave 90% of all the Super PAC money raised in 2012. Fewer than 200 Americans gave half of all that money spent by Super PACs. Now that, and I did a little math coming up in the plane to make sure I was right, that is 1% of 1% of 1%. It's a very small number of Americans who are the key players in terms of financing candidates and being heard by them. The next problem is how all of this money is raised, because it's raised by candidates and by members of Congress, who are now required by our system to spend hours and hours every workday, weekends and nights raising this money. These are hours not spent doing what members of Congress are elected to do and paid by us to do, which is work on legislation, attend committee hearings, talk with their colleagues, seek consensus, understand legislation, all the things that might make our Congress work better. Instead, members spend those hours during the week in call centers, sitting in booths calling people they don't know, names they've been given by the party committees, or at breakfast, cocktail, and dinner fundraisers with the small group of people willing to pay $1,000, $5,000 for their company. Not because they want, because they do want something from them. They're not usually constituents, but rather Washington lobbyists. This system was also at work in the 2012 presidential election. Let me give you two numbers from that election, relating to that election. The two numbers are 9 and 222. 9 is the number of fundraisers that President Ronald Reagan attended during his re-election year in 1984. None of those were for his own campaign because he was in the public funding system, but he went to 9 fundraisers during the year for the party. 222, as you probably feared, is the number of fundraisers that President Barack Obama attended in his re-election year. That's just an enormous number. And the point of the public funding system was to take presidents out of the business, particularly as incumbents when they're running for re-election, of spending all of their time doing something other than being president, and spending all of their time with people who want something very specific from them, rather than with constituents or talking about public issues. How the money gets raised is as much of a problem, I think, as where it is coming from. How did we get to this point? How did we end up raising and spending $7 billion and a flood of secret money? One answer is that the current Supreme Court, the Roberts Court as it's known, I think particularly on this issue, is at war with the post-Watergate campaign finance reforms and at war with Congress's attempt to deal with corruption and the appearance of corruption in federal campaign fundraising, such as through the McCain-Feingold law. As all of you recall, that law was upheld by the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision when the court first looked at it. Then Justice Sandra Day O'Connor retired, and she was replaced by Justice Alito. Now, Justice O'Connor was the only justice on the court who had actually run for public office. She had campaigned, she had raised money, she had been elected to the legislature in Arizona, and in the legislature, she had been a majority leader, she'd been involved in party fundraising, and of course involved in drafting legislation. So she understood from personal experience that there were problems out there, that there was going to be tension in a free market system and a economy of private funded elections between the legislative acts and the campaign acts. And I'm convinced that her vote to uphold McCain-Feingold came from that personal experience. I don't know that she would have written the law that way, but I think she respected Congress's right to draw those lines, and she understood the corruption and the danger of corruption that Congress was trying to deal with. Now that she's gone from the court, no justice has that experience, and instead the Supreme Court has 5 justices who think they know more than Congress and 50 state legislatures about how campaigns work and the dangers of corruption in the legislative process, or rather, in the view of those 5, the acceptability of corruption and the appearance of corruption in the legislative process. You have heard of the Citizens United decision in 2010, but the Roberts Court attack on campaign finance law began several cases and years earlier. First, in a case out of New England, Randall v. Sorrell, the court struck down Vermont's limits on campaign contributions to candidates and limits on spending, even though the Supreme Court had previously deferred to limits set by Congress and had found that contribution limits in almost any amount were constitutional because, among other things, giving a contribution, the court said, was a symbolic act of speech, and thus the amount was less important than the symbolism. The Roberts Court rejected that and replaced itself instead of the Vermont legislature as the fact finder and policymaker. And it found that the Vermont limits were, quote, too low to fund adequate campaign spending. I don't know what adequate campaign spending is, but presumably the people in Vermont knew more than the 5 justices on the court about how elections worked in Vermont. Then, in Wisconsin Right to Life, 2007, the court struck down a series of provisions of the McCain-Feingold law that limited corporate and labor money spent on issue advertising. This is an important part of that law designed to keep corporate and labor money out of elections, and the court threw that out. Then, in what I think is a really interesting case, the Davis case, the same year, the court struck down a piece of McCain-Feingold known as the Millionaires Amendment. Now, this was something Congress had passed in an attempt to deal with the unlimited spending that millionaires have because the Supreme Court has said constitutionally they can't be prevented from spending as much of their own money as they want. So Congress said, fine, but if a candidate is facing unlimited spending by a millionaire, then the candidate's own contribution limits would go up so that they could raise, speak more. And the court said that was unconstitutional because even though it created more speech by the candidates who would raise more, it could disadvantage the millionaire. So, you know, they viewed that as penalizing the millionaire for spending their own money rather than giving the rest of us more speech. Then, in 2010, the Roberts Court finally gave us the famous Citizens United. The court ruled the government could not prohibit the political speech of corporations in elections, allowing them to make unlimited independent expenditures. Now, much has been written about this. We don't need to dwell on it at huge length tonight. Justice Stevens, just last week, testified before the Senate, and you probably read his comments also, I think, in an interview in the New York Times, when he said that Citizens United and then the McCutcheon case of this year were a giant step in the wrong direction. And he said that the actions of the majority of the court were a violation of the court's norms of procedure and deference to Congress. Justice Stevens, in testifying before the Senate last week, and I must say I sat behind him while he was doing that because I was next up to testify. I envied him. He came in, he gave his talk, he didn't take any questions, he left. That's the way to testify before Congress, but I think it was historic. I think it's the first time that I know of that a retired justice has testified on matters currently before the courts. I'd note just 3 I think, dangerous flaws in the Citizens United decision. One, the court's narrowing definition of corruption. Two, its false statement that all of this new spending would be fully disclosed. And three, its completely incorrect assumptions about the independence of those independent expenditures. First, on corruption, the court found that there is no corruption from independent speech. Not that it didn't see any, or it was debatable and it hadn't been proved, just as a matter of the universe, there is no such thing as corrupting independent speech, no matter how much it is, the circumstances, who is spending all that money. Then they said corruption is only quid pro quo, bribery, that selling access or giving big donors what they want is not corruption. Justice Kennedy, you think I'm kidding? Justice Kennedy said, the appearance of influence or access, furthermore, will not cause the electorate to lose faith in our democracy. So I'm sure none of you have lost faith looking at what's happening. Under this theory, extended by Justice Roberts and McCutcheon this year, only the direct payment for an official act is corruption. But Buckley, back 30 years ago, had talked about corruption and the appearance of corruption as what Congress could properly regulate. By contrast, Justice Roberts doubles down and said in the McCutcheon case last month, government regulation may not target the general gratitude that a candidate may feel towards those who support him or his allies, or the political access such support may afford. So Roberts is saying Congress can't deal with this problem, that the appearance of corruption is no longer a legitimate governmental concern, that the Congress or your legislature can regulate. I think this is a view that would actually shock our founders. Professor Lessig, who I know has been very active in New Hampshire and has this new May 1 Super PAC that I've been helping him some with. He's done a lot of research, and one of the things that he comes up with is that the founders spent an enormous amount of time talking about corruption, by which they meant not selling something in return for money, they meant the general access by one group, small group in society, so that they ended up controlling government contrary to the wishes of the rest of the people. Now, full disclosure, here is what Justice Kennedy said in Citizens United. A campaign finance system that pairs corporate independent expenditures with effective disclosure has not existed before today. Now, with the advent of the internet, prompt disclosure of expenditures can provide shareholders and citizens with the information needed to hold corporations and elected officials accountable for their positions and supporters. Now, the good news is that this language saying disclosure is a great thing was adopted by 8 of the 9 Supreme Court justices. Only Justice Thomas did not. The bad news, of course, is that what he said about disclosure, full disclosure, effective disclosure, existing today is wrong. It doesn't exist. We have secret money through these C4s, C6s, all these other entities that are not political committees registered and reporting their donors. The McCain-Feingold legislation had attempted to deal with this. It has a provision, so we're now talking about the law of the land, passed by Congress, signed by the President, upheld by the Supreme Court 8-1. And it says that if any group spends $1,000 or more for election ads featuring a candidate in an election season, that they have to disclose the donors to that group of $1,000 or more. The only way out of that, doesn't matter what the group is, a C6, a C4, whatever, the only way out of that is if they set up a separate fund just for that advertising, and then they pay for it out of that fund, and they disclose the donors to that fund. So what happened? Well, the FEC, my former agency, went in 2007 and gutted that. They added a purpose requirement, which Congress had not added because Congress isn't that dumb. The purpose requirement says you only have to disclose the donors who gave you the $1,000 to run the ads if they gave you for the purpose. They gave the money for the purpose of funding the ad. You won't be surprised to know that nobody anymore ever gives for the purpose of funding an ad. They instead just give money to groups that they know are running these ads, and since they don't say on it, please use my money to fund the ad in New Hampshire, it doesn't have to be disclosed. So that's the second problem. The third problem is this whole independent idea. Now this is important because the court's theory is, as I've explained, that independent expenditures cannot corrupt. That's a small problem of its own, but when you get past that and say, all right, what's an independent expenditure? Justice Kennedy in Citizens United says, it is by definition, an expenditure is political speech presented to the electorate that is not coordinated with a candidate. Elsewhere, the court talks about spending that is wholly, completely, totally independent of candidates and political parties. So, those of you who were alive and sent in 2012 saw the Romney Super PAC run by former Romney campaign ads with Governor Romney meeting with the top donors to thank them for funding his independent Super PAC. That was matched by the Obama Super PAC, headed by two former top White House officials, endorsed by the president publicly, with cabinet officials dispatched to Super PAC events. Then you had Speaker Gingrich meeting behind closed doors with the one individual who totally funded his Super PAC, Senator Santorum, traveling for a week on the campaign trail with the largest funder of his Super PAC. So this year, what do we have? Well, of course, we have Senate candidates across the country, House candidates, each with their own Super PAC, headed by former campaign aides or even relatives in some cases. So what's the problem? The problem is this huge gap between the Supreme Court definition of independent, wholly, totally, completely independent of candidates and parties, and the reality, which is governed by, again, an FEC regulation that very narrowly defines coordination, basically to the point of saying it's not coordinated unless the candidate screens and edits the ads before they run, which is, pretty different. This is a huge issue because the court's whole theory is the only reason this money can be unlimited, and thus the only reason corporations and unions can spend unlimited amounts, is because this is totally independent speech. If it's not, then it doesn't have a right to be unlimited, says this court, and it could be limited by states. So one of the things we need to do around the country is start passing definitions of independence that look like the Supreme Court's rather than look like the FEC's, so that these outside groups will no longer be considered outside, and instead you can limit how much people give to them. So after that mess of Citizens United, the Roberts Court, believe it or not, still had two cases left in it before today. The first was an Arizona case, and here Arizona had a public financing law, and it provided that you would get X dollars from the system if you voluntarily agreed to participate. However, if a candidate who didn't participate then went out and spent more than that, the state would come in and give the candidate in the system more money to be able to continue to communicate and conduct the campaign. First, it was designed basically as government efficiency. Why give a candidate $10 million if they only need $1 million? Why waste it? But if they take the $1 million from the state and the other candidate comes in and spends $5 of their own money outside of the system, then the state would give the candidate in the system another $4, so that they would have what you would think was more speech. Case for my friend Charles Freed, a distinguished Harvard law professor, former member of the Massachusetts Supreme Court, and you will be perhaps surprised to hear, Ronald Reagan's Solicitor General, a true conservative Republican from Massachusetts. And Professor Freed wrote in his brief in the court, this can't possibly be unconstitutional because it's more speech, and that's a good thing. Well, the 5 said, no, you can't do that. It is unconstitutional because this system, again, might discourage the independent spender, the person with unlimited personal funds, and is penalizing them for spending their own money. So they saw it as a penalty rather than a way to make the system work and to give us all more campaign speech. Now the danger here, of course, is that what this flags is the possibility that these 5 justices will find any good, strong public financing system that provides a lot of resources to participants as potentially unconstitutional because it might discourage people who are not participating in the system because they already have all the money they need. So that's a problem. And then most recently the McCutcheon case, which was the case that struck down the aggregate limits on how much people can give to candidates and party committees. It used to be that although you could give to a candidate or a party committee, there was a total limit on what an individual could give in a cycle to all these federal candidates and committees combined of about $123,000. Now, you probably don't know a lot of people who give $123,000 every cycle. That's because there only were 600 of them in the last cycle. But the court has said that's unconstitutional. You can't limit their aggregate speech. Again, circling back, because it's not corrupt and there's no danger in selling access. There's nothing wrong with selling access or selling meetings. So go ahead and give to as many candidates as you can and party committees. If you do the math, that means that if you just wanted to support all those Democrats or all those Republicans for federal office, you could write a check of about $3.5 million. And through the magic of something called a joint fundraising committee, which the FEC has approved and has operated for a while, they can all get together. So you just write one check to the committee, solicited by the president, solicited by the Speaker of the House, but the court didn't seem bothered at all by the idea that checks would be that big. So that's where we are post-McCutcheon. To recap, the justices currently in charge say that in their view, the highest constitutional value is unlimited spending by those who have unlimited money in our elections. Then, the narrow definition of corruption and the appearance of corruption has to be construed to strike down more and more reasonable limits on the raising of campaign money, and the appearance of corruption really gets written out of that. Election spending is not fully disclosed, $400 million in the last election, and it's rising. All of this outside activity is not, in fact, independent of candidates and parties, and thus, by the court's own admission, potentially corrupting. And attempts to create public funding alternatives will be suspect if they appear to penalize non-participants by making public funding attractive and workable. So, this is a moment to stop and think about basic American values. Values in our democracy. Full participation, including the ability to communicate and have our voices heard for all citizens. The question of who is a constituent. Justice Stevens had a field day with the Roberts opinion in McCutcheon, because Roberts starts out by saying, this case is about the ability of constituents to speak and be heard. And Stevens says, that's the kernel of the problem. Those people are not constituents. They're only financial contributors. So Justice Roberts is confusing financial contributors from other states with constituents. And so Stevens says, we should have a conversation about who actually has these speech rights. And Justice Breyer, in his dissent in McCutcheon, says, the point of the First Amendment was to enable citizens to communicate with their government, with their representatives. In an election, you have a chance to vote them in or keep them. But in between, while they're in Washington, you communicate as a citizen and as a voter by speaking. And Breyer says that speech is getting flooded out by money from people who are not constituents, who are in fact monopolizing the conversation by being campaign contributors. So it's a different way of looking at the First Amendment. there is the historic danger, as I noted, Professor Lessig has done a lot of work on, that our founders were concerned about, allowing a small subset of society to control elections and thus control government, whether that is a crowned monarch back then, an aristocracy, or a couple hundred of the richest Americans in a country with over 340 million citizens. I think we as citizens are willing to respect the legitimacy of a government so long as we believe it is transparent and acting in the national interest. However, I think we also distrust decisions of a government when we see it as captured by narrow special interests. And the risk is that we Americans will ultimately reject that government as not being legitimate. So, we have a lot of work to do, building a better view of the First Amendment, mobilizing citizens to convince state legislatures and Congress that we care about these issues, and ultimately to again reform our campaign finance system. So it's time to start, and I would suggest a great place to start is in New Hampshire, not only because you have good government and you have active, engaged citizens, but you have that great seat as the first presidential primary in the nation, and so you have the attention of a lot of candidates. I know that you've got the Democracy Matters group, which is working here, focusing on that. All of that, I think, gives you an opportunity to start really making a difference here and lead the rest of the country. So, thank you very much.
Let's do some questions and answers, but first, Martha LeClark wanted a minute just to...
I'd like to thank all of you that are in this room tonight who worked so hard to bring the petitions requesting that we overturn the Citizens United and related cases that you put before all of your local town meetings this spring. And to let you know, I'm sure you all know that 48 of those were passed. It was a huge... And I also want to thank you for the support that you have given me in trying to move forward a committee to work on advising our legislator so that our legislature can advise our congressional delegation on what is the best process, the best amendment to overturn Citizens United and related cases. So I'm very appreciative. You've done a fantastic job. Don't know where this is going to go, but we have to continue fighting. And I'm so glad you're here tonight, and I just wanted to thank you all.
If there are a couple of questions. Yes?
What is going on in the heads of those 5 justices of the Supreme Court? I mean, what is their sort of philosophical basis? Are they simply totally beguiled with the Koch brothers and the other rich people who wine them and dine them? What are they thinking?
Yeah, I wonder that too, and particularly, I've gone to a number of these arguments and I've sat there and heard the questions, and there really are 2 different worldviews. I mean, I go back, first of all, to saying, this is a remarkably academically oriented, cloistered, ideological, philosophical group. The court used to have governors, former governors, former senators, so forth, and that's not where we are now. So you have people who don't have much experience with the give and take of politics, the potential corruption. I do think that's an important issue. Then you have an ideological view. I won't say it is partisan in the sense that I don't think the 5 set out to say how do we elect more Republicans, but they start from a view that there is simply too much government regulation and too much regulation in this area. that speech should be speech, anyone should do anything they want, the government shouldn't have anything to do with it, no law means no law. In the First Amendment it says Congress shall make no law respecting the freedom of speech. So they start with the assumption that all of this is some creation of a democratic, in the sense of capital D, Democratic Party, Lyndon Johnson, Great Society government, and our job is to get rid of it all. Now, the fact that it came about because of the Watergate scandal doesn't seem to have any resonance. That there were real problems here, that it's been passed by Congress on a bipartisan basis. Even McCain-Feingold would not have passed without significant Republican support. That gets to the next thing, which is there was a wonderful moment in the argument in the Arizona case about public financing. Justice Scalia has clearly felt, and he said in his question there, this is all incumbent protection. Members of Congress get to write the laws, and they write laws that favor them. And so they restrict speaking rights, speech by their opponents, their challengers, and they favor their own ability to spend and communicate. Isn't that really what's happening in these cases? Well, it was the wrong case for him to ask that in, because the Arizona public financing system had been passed over the objections of the legislature by a citizen initiative. However, I think that is part of their worldview, that in this area, whereas O'Connor looked at it as the legislature knows what they're doing, we should defer to them because they are honestly identifying a problem, which is corruption and the appearance of corruption, and they're trying to come up with a fair answer. And it doesn't look to us as if they particularly favor themselves here. There are plenty of members of Congress, for instance, who are millionaires who might be the ones actually spending the money that their challengers could raise to compete with. So her view was, unless there's a real red flag, we'll defer to Congress. And I think the view of the 5 justices in the majority is, we're never going to defer to Congress on this. We're going to assume that they are wrong and self-interested, and therefore we're going to step in. So it's a different worldview. They also, I think the underlying values are different. I mean, Breyer is talking about the importance of involving citizens, the importance of constituents being heard, meaning voters heard by members, whereas the majority has a much narrower, one-dimensional view, which is we don't want anything to prevent someone from spending money to speak. Spending money is therefore their right, and nothing should prevent the spending of money. And so they're seeing it, again, maybe from a more libertarian view, as this person should be able to spend as much as they want because that's what the Constitution defends. Whereas Breyer looks at it and says the Constitution defends a workable, non-corrupt government that citizens have faith in, and that may involve, at a minimum, enabling other people to speak so you have more than one voice. So I think there are different worldviews on all this, and I'm not convinced that they're hearing each other. I think they write their majorities and their dissents and they pass in the night a bit. There's a question in the back. Yes?
What about the dark, secret money that lacks transparency? Because I think people hear that, and what they don't understand is, but the people that do know that dark, secret, transparent money is the candidates. They know where those checks are coming from. We don't know. The only people that the money is dark to is us. The people that, I run, and I know too many stories about people writing a check in front of someone so they can see it, all right? And it will go to that PAC, it'll do whatever, but they're doing it so because there's no definition of coordination, and now coordination really has no meaning, the only people that are kept in the dark is us.
No, that's
and you speak everywhere, Attorney Potter. Make sure people understand it's not dark for them. There's lots of light on those things. It's for us that it's dark.
You're absolutely right. The people are
We're talking about constituents versus investors. I'm very worried about the fact that the court's concept that they don't understand what a constituent is going to be set aside because we have a guy running for the United States Senate named Scott Brown. Depending on the hour, I'll tell you what his constituents are. Because if he wins here, the concept of constituency blows out. Because there really is, he will have only been here for such a short period of time that this is more like, shopping for a seat than it is being a representative of New Hampshire. And that means that what the court is saying, and their decision is that they do see those checks as going to whomever. Scott Brown will prove their point. Because we are really not his constituents, but we will be a vehicle for him to get to the United States Senate.
The court has upheld what they have called reasonable residency requirements. Obviously, Senator Brown must meet whatever the New Hampshire residency requirement is. But it still makes it a legitimate part of the public debate. Is this person really, does this person really know New Hampshire? Does this person really represent us? I think where Stevens and Breyer are going with the constituency side is even further, though, to say people who don't even claim to live in the state, who live on the other side of the country, why do they have the right to, in some cases, essentially select the people who are going to represent New Hampshire? So they would go to the funding that your Senate candidates have and say, why shouldn't people in Vermont have the first say in that? Why can't you have lower limits for people who are from outside the state? And they would raise, I think, that question. On the dark money side, you're absolutely right. And one of the things that I keep hearing from members of Congress is a further twist on that, which is, first of all, we know where the money is coming from. There's no requirement that it be kept secret from us. They just don't have to disclose it publicly. Secondly, and this is really the insidious part, once you have this system going, you don't even have to spend it. What you have to do is go in and see a member of Congress and say, I'd really love your support on this, the industry I represent, this is really important to them. We've gotten along over the years, and I would just hate it if their super PACs had to go after you in the election. They did last time, they've got more money than God. It just, be a shame if that's how things turned out, and I hope we can avoid that. There was actually, in a federal court case, there's an example in North Carolina where lobbyists went in and said, I want to show you something to the member. Let me just put this tape, as I think it then was, in your machine. And there was an attack ad, attacking the member, and saying that they had done X, Y, or Z, or refused to do it. And then they turned the machine off and said, now, we don't have to run that ad. It's up to you. If you can help us out in committee, we won't run that ad. Now, that is apparently, under the majority's view, that's lobbying. That's just expressing yourself. That's not, that's the sort of thing that they would think is permissible, if not all right. And that's the sort of value we have to step in and say, that's a problem here. And if it's being used in the lobbying system that way, it's a problem here. If members of Congress are afraid to take votes, which they now are, because they can see it as a negative ad. There was this current senator from Connecticut has just written a piece where he says one of the reasons Congress doesn't do much and the Senate doesn't allow amendments is that the leadership is afraid that if you have amendments and full discussion on the amendments and votes on them, that they'll all then be used by the super PACs as attack ads. And in fact, that he thinks the Republican leadership is working with these outside groups to try to put these amendments in so that they can force the vote and then run the attack ad. So that's a terrible way to legislate, to be afraid of that.
Boils down to the polarization that has really seized legislation in Washington, even here in Concord. And how do you see it working out? Is it something where campaign finance has to be solved first, or is it something where polarization can be addressed so that then consensus can be gathered around the idea of campaign finance?
There's a lot of concern, I think, with polarization. I it's interesting to me, I think it is worse in Washington than it is in the states, and that's obviously a generic statement. There may be states where it's just as bad, but as I travel around, I often will have conversations with state legislators, and there are Republicans and Democrats in the room. They probably have different views on the issues. We talk about disclosure. The Republicans get uncomfortable in legislation to disclose because a lot of the money being spent that's undisclosed is, at the moment, business money and tends to be more pro-Republican. But they're in the room talking about it. And what I say to them is, if I were in Washington, you would not have Republicans and Democrats in the same room. Part of that is that the leadership discourages it in the polarization, but I think it does go to what I was saying in terms of how they now spend their time. They don't talk to each other. They don't know each other. I went to the Senate dining room with a former senator, and it's a grand room and so forth. He said hello to a variety of other former senators. He said to me, you know, when I was here, this room was full of senators, but not anymore. They don't have time, they're making fundraising calls. Oh. So the opportunities that you, in some idyllic world, which is not that long ago, where you actually got to know your colleagues and worked in committee and had coffee with them, had a drink after work, or whatever, that has really changed. And I think a driver of that is the demand for fundraising time, and that sucked up time that used to be spent together. And you aren't going to reach a consensus if you're not talking to each other. It's a lot harder to talk to each other if you literally don't know who the other person is. You've never had a off-record conversation, and that's where we are. Yes?
If the court is opposed, as you said, or committed to be opposed to the views of Congress, do you see a path whereby the direction we're heading can be changed or reversed?
Yeah, the question is, so if this is where the court is going, how in the world do you change it? I think through a variety of ways. I'd start with a statement that is often misunderstood, but it says, the court reads the election returns. By that, I think it means more generally that even though this is a group that is somewhat isolated from society and not representative of the political system, as I've explained, they still live in society and they are affected by changing views. I think to the extent that we as a people reject Citizens United, reject the notion that the only value here is unlimited spending, and instead, through the resolutions that cities and states around the country are adopting, through the actions of your representatives in Washington who are being pressured by you to do something, through writings in law review articles, through the research that is being done to explain that the court simply was factually wrong in saying this would all be disclosed, and how much is not being disclosed, and it would all be independent, and how it is not independent. All of that, I think, ultimately reaches even those 5 justices. And they may be sure they're right, and justices tend to think they're right, but they will be aware that society is moving the other way. And the court doesn't that long stay at odds with where the country is. Partly, if you take a sort of medium-term view, the court doesn't, because the court changes. People retire. New justices come on. And I would love to be in a situation where a new justice came on and the questions in the confirmation hearing is, what are you going to do about Citizens United? What's your view of the First Amendment? How do we find a way to enable Congress and the states to deal with the problem of this money being spent? Would you favor a constitutional amendment? No. That's the sort of thing that affects the court going forward, is the climate in which they operate changing. And I think over time it does. Yes?
When Arnie was just telling us about the Scott Brown fervor and that misdirection, I found myself thinking about Jim Rubin, who is running for Senate as a Republican.
He just entered the room.
And I was just thinking about it, and he entered the room. And he was with Larry Lessig and New Hampshire Rebellion. He was the only Republican who came to speak at that Granny D birthday event in Nashua. And because he's here, I had this question: how has dark money approached you and you've refused it? I mean, what has that been like? Has that happened?
It's a new world out here.
Yeah.
We're going to experiment and find out.
Oh!
It's an experiment I'm running. I don't know how it's going to turn out. Is our New Hampshire people for sale or not is the big question. And stains are on every hand.
Because this is the first Sunday Monitor where I saw Scott Brown named, and Republican, whatever, but you were not reported on in this past Sunday Monitor, and that made me feel sad.
The media plays a role in this. The media used to be independent and would report on issues. They actually follow the money. I don't think they do it intentionally as a result possibly of cutbacks, of following what's popular, just doing what people want to hear about. It tends to suppress debate about issues, and it tends to suppress communication by candidates who might not be favored by dark money sources.
I think one of the problems is that the press tends to report on the race by reporting on the fundraising.
Yes.
And so their view, there's a story coming up because the next report is due, and we'll learn how much money they've raised, and then we'll report on how the race is going by talking about who raised how much. And that, of course, leaves out the essence of the campaign. But it's a shorthand. It may be they're understaffed. It may be that it's just a convenient peg, but it happens, I think, far too often. Question in the front here.
Isn't there a parallel universe which is lobbying that has grown so tremendously in the last 30 years and deprives the average voter, the average citizen, of really any influence on issues, across the whole board? And it's only sort of peripherally related to the funding, but it's a separate industry that gets its way to an increasing degree.
So the question is, don't we have, in addition to this discussion about campaign finance, the parallel issue of lobbying, the number of lobbyists, the amount of resources they have, and doesn't that really tend to dominate the legislative process? I think to some extent lobbying has really been revolutionized. Jack Abramoff, the convicted felon who was a lobbyist, has had a number of interesting things to say that I think are worth listening to. One was, I was a chump because I could have done 99% of what I did perfectly legally if only I had bothered to figure out what the law was and follow it, but I was too ego-driven to do it. But he says the bad news is most of what I did could have still been done. One of the things he said he found particularly effective was to say to staff in Congress, someday when you're out looking for something, come see me. And he said, there's nothing illegal about saying that. And yet their behavior changed instantly. They suddenly thought they were going to get a job offer. And he said, instead of my lobbying them, they'd lobby me. They'd call me up and say, I don't know if you noticed, but something has been introduced in committee you need to pay attention to. So you have that problem. He referred to the United States Congress as the farm team for K Street. K Street being the street where the lobbyists are. Well, the world has changed. Not for everybody, but there are members of Congress who can go from earning their, I don't know what a congressional salary is now, 175 I hear in the room. That sounds about right, under 200. You can triple that easily. You can go on up from there. There is a member of Congress who was re-elected in 2012, but left to take a lobbying job before she was sworn in to her new term. And she explained that her ex-constituents would obviously understand this was a rare opportunity, this was a trade association she'd been longing for, and it had come up now, and so she had better take it. It's a different way of looking at things. But I do think that partly it is that it is well compensated, and so it is seen as where you graduate to as opposed to what you do when you can't do anything else. However, the money still is connected to it, because one of the reasons the lobbyists are effective is they're also fundraisers. And they are bundlers, and they introduce the members to the people, they bring the PAC contributions, they actually use the contribution as their entry ticket to all of these events, which are in fact legislative, lobbying events. If you ever go to a fundraising breakfast, member comes in, shakes all the hands, checks have been collected, opens it up for questions. Senator, what are your views on the such and such an item in committee? This is not a campaign discussion, this is, business discussion. So it is possible. I think one of the things that I had a lot of fun doing was creating this American Anti-Corruption Act. For those of you who don't know it, go Google it. But it's not a piece of legislation that's been introduced by any member of Congress. I would be thrilled if it were, but the purpose was to say it is possible within the current Constitution as seen by the 5 majority justices at the moment to still change the way Washington works, predominantly by addressing lobbying, by saying that when you leave Congress there is a 10-year revolving door provision, not a 1-year, by saying that lobbying includes signing up to advise the lobbying coalition and tell them what to do, rather than going and doing it yourself, because there are a bunch of former members who are not registered lobbyists, but they earn their living in the lobbying world. And the members of Congress are well aware that they're there, they're the public face, but they don't have the registered lobbying. Then saying to lobbyists, you're free to give your money, but you cannot raise money for the people you lobby. To cut the connection with the work of the committees. So there are a range of ways I think we could somewhat change the equation and make it less appealing and less powerful. Nobody's going to say, A, you can't lobby, that's in the Constitution. B, nobody is going to be able to take the expertise away, and if you don't have professional staff and you've got someone who has all this knowledge, you're going to listen to them. But I think there are ways to disconnect the money from it, and that would help.
Thank you.
Why don't we just have a couple more questions?
I see one in the back there.
In this off-year election, and then I hate to think of it in less than 2 years when all the presidential primary candidates are around, what is one question that we should ask candidates when we meet them and are able to ask them a question in public?
That's a great question. I suspect there are plenty of people who will have given that more thought, and I hope will over the next year and a half. But I think I'd say we in New Hampshire are unhappy with the current system of money and politics. We think you should be too. Are you? Point one. And if you are, what exactly are you doing about it, or would you tell us you will agree to do about it? It's the second part that's the hard one. I was up here a couple of years ago, I won't embarrass the poor person, but I heard a presidential candidate giving a stump speech, and it was a reform group that this person was speaking to, so they talked about the importance of campaign reform, the importance of lobbying reform, so forth. The question was, well, what exactly do you favor doing? Long pause. Followed by, that's a very tough question. I really don't know. I think it's something that my children and grandchildren will have to grapple with. So, hold their feet to the fire, but I think the question is, are you happy with the system? And if you're not, what exactly is it that you will do about it?
Great.
And push it from there. I have one in the back over there who's been waiting patiently in the blue shirt.
Trevor, great to have you in New Hampshire.
Dan, I can't see you in the lights.
Yeah. You've been a great friend to Americans for Campaign Reform and a lot of other reform groups. When you're riding the airplane up here and you finished working out your math problems, or maybe in the taxi, explaining what you're doing to the person next to you, how do you make this real for the, unfortunately, far too many people who aren't in this room tonight and who get it, connected to issues that they're dealing with in daily life, so they get mad and do something about it too?
Well, a lot of people spend time saying, how do we best communicate this issue, these problems? What we've learned is unfortunately, a list of things that tend to cause eyes to glaze over. So I've learned that I don't say I'm concerned about campaign finance reform. Whatever that phrase is, it has a Z quality to it. I think saying you're in favor of public financing or public funding without more doesn't convey enough, and it's now a tainted term because the opponents of it have used it and attacked it. So partly it's a language matter. I think what people need to understand is the connection that this issue has with everything else they care about. That if you're concerned about the environment, if you're concerned about industrial policy or low wages or the growing gap between segments of society and so forth, that is all tied to government policy. If you're talking to conservatives and they are correctly concerned about crony capitalism and the amount of money that we spend on tax breaks because lobbyists have inserted these into the bill and nobody can get them out because they have a strong constituency in the group that want to get it out or diffuse. Those are the sorts of issues that relate directly to campaign finance because it's those interests through their lobbyists and through their campaign contributions that put those in there and are going to fight to get people to keep them in there. So I think you have to relate it to the broader issues people are facing and then say, wouldn't it be nice if they weren't beholden to this handful of donors or to the Washington financing mechanism, and instead we're listening to us. I think that's a place to start. Last question over here.
Thank you. Rather than asking an open-ended question to a politician, he'll throw out platitudes without saying anything. Why not just start demanding that all our candidates for Congress and the President refuse PAC money, denounce Super PACs, refuse out-of-state money, just take in-state contributions from their constituents? Why not now start making that demand and just say this PAC money is legal corruption? So are you going to accept it or are you going to be an honest candidate?
I should have. I should have known better than to tell a room of New Hampshire people how to question candidates. That's as good as any. Thank you all very much.
Says it all. Thank you. You're going to be around. We have a few more minutes here, so if you want to catch specific questions. Speaking of money, of course, Coalition for Open Democracy. Seriously, we need the money to get these bills done. We have. We accept big donations. Please help us out. Thank you all for coming and. Good night.